Good day. I'm Larry C. Johnson. Before I proceed with the rest of the video, let me remind you to tick the like button once you've watched and listened to the video or whatever part of the video you choose to watch and you decide that you've liked what you've heard and want to indicate that fact. Let me begin with a brief discussion of the situation in my own country, the political situation in Britain. Apologies to those outside Britain for whom this might seem a somewhat parochial topic, and frankly, apologies also to some people in Britain who may be less than excited by this story. Over the last couple of days, as I discussed in my program yesterday, there have been clear signs that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is on the ropes. His political position is collapsing, and his future as Prime Minister is narrowing by the hour. The event that precipitated this political crisis, if crisis is the right word, some might call it deliverance, was a speech given about a week ago by the British Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves. In that speech, she indicated that the Labour government was about to raise the general rate of income tax, breaking in the process a promise given by the Labour Party before the last general election. Well, surprise, surprise. As it became clear that Starmer's political position was collapsing, last night we got the news that this increase in the general rate of income tax, which supposedly absolutely had to happen to stabilize Britain's finances, has now been called off. We are being told that this is because there has been an updated forecast of the state of the country's finances and that this increase in taxation is no longer necessary. You can believe that if you wish. If you do, all I can say is that I have a bridge to sell you. Clearly, the Prime Minister has realized that he doesn't have the political capital or the political support, even within his own party, to push such an increase in general taxation through. So we are not going to see the increase in general taxation that only a week ago we were told was absolutely essential to stabilize Britain's finances. And this morning, even as I make this program, there are signs that the international financial markets are worried and unhappy that Britain's borrowing costs are rising and that there is renewed pressure on the international rating of Britain's currency, the pound sterling. I've said in many programs now that Britain effectively doesn't have a government. We have administration instead of government. The government is unable to make major policy decisions about the economy or pretty much anything else. We now have further proof it cannot cut welfare spending. It cannot increase taxes. It has no economic plan, no political authority, no political capital, despite a 160-plus majority in the House of Commons. It can administer, but it cannot govern. As some would say, it is in office, but not in power. So Britain is drifting, and it will continue to drift. The only thing that the government, the opposition, and the entire political class remain united about, the only thing they can actually do is continue their economic and political struggle against Russia, a country immeasurably more powerful than Britain and one in close alliance with China, which is orders of magnitude more powerful still. Never mind that even the United States, Britain's ally, has at times shown flickers of doubt about the wisdom of this whole enterprise. Just plow on. Continue to advocate more sanctions against Russia, even though that makes Britain's own economic problems worse. Continue to supply weapons to Zelinsky in Ukraine, even though this further reduces the combat capability of Britain's already disastrously diminished armed forces. Go on transferring billions of pounds each year to Zelinsky's budget, ignoring the now open reports of massive corruption in Ukraine, and in the process, make Britain's budgetary crisis, which despite what the government pretends this morning is very real, still worse. That is the only thing they can actually do. Anything else they try to do runs into too much opposition. It puts the Prime Minister's position in jeopardy. It puts the entire government's position in jeopardy. So they just go on doing the one thing they can do, even though it steadily worsens the overall condition of the country. Now, a couple of points here. I've discussed in many programs how our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, goes out of his way to embrace what I've called the Zelinsky curse. But it's fair to say he's not the only one. The entire British political class is doing the same thing. By doing so, They are making the entire country embrace the Zelinsky curse. That's the first point. The second is that Starmer has only bought himself a small amount of time, perhaps a few more weeks, by this latest U-turn. His attempt to raise taxes and then to cancel that very same tax rise may calm the mood among his parliamentary party for a few days, but it resolves nothing. In a few weeks, all the worries, stresses, fears, and concerns will come back with renewed force. And in the meantime, what he has done underlines the fact that he is a weak prime minister, unable to make firm decisions, unable to lead the country or even his own party. The French prime minister of the 1952nd, Pierre Mendès France, said that to govern is to choose. In the case of Keir Starmer, he cannot choose. He cannot govern. All he can do is support his friend Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. That is all he has. That is all that is left to him. Anyway, let's continue with the rest of the program. We have had further dramatic developments in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. Last night, the Russians conducted another massive drone and missile strike against Ukraine. This one appears to have focused heavily on Kyiv itself, targeting the city's energy system. Apparently, 2 power facilities near Kyiv were specifically targeted. I have not yet been able to get a precise sense of the dimensions of this strike, but it does appear to have been a large one, comparable to the strike about a week ago. I also don't yet have a full picture of the damage. We'll get more information about that in due course, and no doubt the Russian Defense Ministry will provide its version of events, as will the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. What I can say is that in the previous major Russian attack, we saw, for the first time in several strikes, clear signs that Ukraine's air defenses were operating again, if only after a fashion. There were pictures of the launch of Patriot missile interceptors. We hadn't seen those for some time. A couple of weeks ago, reports appeared that Ukraine had received additional Patriot systems from Germany and Israel. So those have presumably arrived, and that is likely what we saw flickering into action last night. My own sense is that these missiles made little difference to the overall effectiveness of the Russian strike. I understand that entire Patriot systems were provided, but the number of actual interceptor missiles supplied was limited. I can't speak with certainty, but that's my sense of it. Already, Zelensky is begging for more Patriot missiles. He says Ukraine is short of Patriot interceptors, short of air defenses. Over the last 24 or 36 hours, he left Kyiv and went to the Zaporizhia region, the area around Huliaipol. He visited the town of Orikhiv and the headquarters of a Ukrainian brigade stationed there, and he had some interesting things to say. But as soon as that trip ended, he returned to Kyiv, then took the train presumably to Poland, and from there flew to Greece. He arrived in Athens and has been begging the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, for Greece's Patriot systems and its remaining Mirage 2000 jets. Ukraine has already received a small batch of Mirage 2000s from France. I see no evidence that they're making any real difference, and they appear every bit as ineffectual as the vaunted F-16 seconds. Nonetheless, Zelensky has gone to Greece to ask for whatever's left. To my mind, that suggests this latest Russian attack has significantly depleted whatever Patriot missiles Ukraine still had. No doubt it received a few more with the latest deliveries, but that batch has already been heavily consumed by one big Russian strike. So he needs more, or at least claims he does, and he's off to Greece to ask for them. Up to now, the Greeks have been very reluctant to supply Patriot systems and Mirage 2000s. Greece once received air defense systems from Russia, back when relations were reasonably good. Athens was later persuaded to hand some of those over to Ukraine on the promise that it would receive Patriot systems in return. Greece believes it needs robust air defenses because of its permanent conflict with Turkey and the very real Turkish military superiority both in Thrace and across much of the Aegean. No doubt, political pressure from Brussels and perhaps Washington to transfer whatever air defense systems Greece has to Ukraine will now grow. I can't imagine Ursula von der Leyen or many of the usual European figures losing much sleep over Greek security concerns. The real question is whether the Greek government itself is interested in defending Greece's security, and on that point, I have my doubts. I would not be surprised if Greece agrees to part with whatever air defenses it still has, or at least a significant part of them. And if it does, it will all be for nothing, because all of these missiles will quickly be used up. Zelinsky will inevitably come back and ask for more again and again, because he never has enough, and given the nature of this war, cannot have enough. Supplying Ukraine with weapons, especially air defense weapons, is like trying to inflate a balloon that has a hole in it. You can blow air into the balloon as long and as hard as you like. You can leave yourself short of breath. But as soon as you stop blowing, the balloon deflates again. It's bewildering that so many people in Europe, especially in its political and media classes, still don't grasp this. We still see endless demands. Give Ukraine more weapons. All they need are a few more. We're not giving them enough. We've only given them enough to defend themselves, not to win. This narrative is peddled day after day, week after week. The reality is that there is never enough, and given the enormous imbalance in military power and industrial capacity between Russia and Ukraine, and even between Russia and the West collectively, whatever weapons the West can afford to supply will never resolve the underlying problem. We'll see what Zelensky manages to extract from the Greeks and what else the Europeans can come up with. There is also a new narrative circulating in Europe that one of the reasons Ukraine has been losing ground on the battlefield is the American government shutdown, which supposedly brought weapons deliveries from the United States to a halt. I don't know why people keep falling for these stories. I doubt that weapons deliveries from the United States have literally stopped. And in any case, what is preventing European governments who claim to be financing much of this from contacting weapons suppliers directly or working with the Pentagon to get what they want? We're told the shutdown is all about funding. Well, isn't providing funding exactly what the Europeans say they're doing? The reality is that the United States is short of certain types of weapons, and the Europeans are short of certain types of money, specifically money available in the EU budget. It's nonsense to suggest that Ukraine's existing problems are caused by the American shutdown. There's another narrative pushed by people like Friedrich Merz in Germany to the effect that Ukraine's main problem is that it won't conscript younger people, and that Ukrainians are coming to Germany instead of staying in Ukraine to fight. Zelinsky, for his part, has responded sharply, claiming that Ukraine is recruiting 30,000 men a month, a number I consider wildly exaggerated. He says he understands the situation on the front lines, and that those in Europe and the United States who don't have no right to pontificate. For once, on this narrow point, I find myself in some agreement with him. I also find the spectacle of European and American politicians trying to strong-arm the Ukrainians into rounding up more of their own people and sending them to die absolutely chilling. That said, part of the reason this narrative exists is because the Ukrainians have spent so much time minimizing their losses and inflating Russian losses. If you tell Western governments and media that Russian casualties are several times larger than Ukraine's, that Ukraine has not suffered especially severe losses, and that the Russians are the ones bleeding, then some people in the West, if they believe that fantasy, inevitably start asking why the Russians are advancing and outnumbering Ukrainians. They then conclude that Ukraine must not be using its manpower efficiently, that all it needs to do is mobilize more and everything will be fine. If you build your story on false numbers about something as important as casualties, you invite exactly this kind of confusion. Let's turn to another set of developments. Ukraine carried out its own large drone strike against Russia last night. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, they also launched some of their so-called Flamingo missiles, these allegedly prodigious range missiles, with a longer reach than Tomahawks, capable of hitting targets deep inside Russia. I'm not convinced. From what I can see, all the attacks took place in Western Russia. Ukraine did not hit targets in Central Russia, Siberia, the Urals, or other deep interior regions. The one place that may have been struck is the port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, where there is footage of a fire at what appears to be an oil installation. For the record, the claims about Novorossiysk Center on the use of drones, not Flamingo missiles. I'm not entirely sure Flamingo missiles exist in anything more than token quantities. Perhaps they do, but I doubt Ukraine can sustain deep strikes with them. And I would note that the Flamingo missile is now also entangled in Ukraine's big corruption scandal. The Russians claim to have shot down nearly all of the drones launched by Ukraine, and I find that believable. They haven't yet provided a full account of the Novorossiysk incident, but they will. When we eventually have full information about these two strikes, the big Russian attack and the Ukrainian effort in response, my expectation is that it will once again underline the colossal imbalance in striking power. The Russian strike will likely prove devastating in terms of Ukraine's infrastructure, while the Ukrainian strike will have done little more than scratch the paint on Russia's vast energy complex and economy. If you want to understand where the Russian economy is at the moment, don't obsess over Ukrainian drone strikes. Look instead at what the Russian central bank is doing with interest rates. Monetary policy is what determines the pace of the Russian economy at any given moment. I doubt that even the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil recently announced by the United States have anything like the impact on Russia's macroeconomic situation that the central bank's efforts to cool an overheating economy and bring down inflation have. On the subject of sanctions, the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has said that the United States has essentially run out of things in Russia to sanction, which is obviously true. A couple of weeks ago, when the U.S. Treasury imposed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, the American media dutifully spoke of more sanctions in the pipeline. Rubio now hints that may not be the case. I do wonder whether some people in Washington are beginning to suspect that even these latest sanctions were not such a great idea. There are concerns in Europe about refineries in Romania and Bulgaria that depend on Russian crude and about possible shortages. In the U.S., with inflation still sticky and politically damaging, there must be worries about anything that might push energy prices higher. In a recent program we did with U.S. Attorney Robert Barnes, he said the pressure to sanction Lukoil and Rosneft came from the Treasury Secretary, who still believes that the Russian economy is fragile and that it only needs one more good push and it will collapse. I suspect that's true. I suspect that the State Department, which has its own intelligence apparatus, is now more skeptical, even though it is heavily dominated by neocon thinking. Treasury, however, finds it hard to let go of the idea that sanctions will eventually work. And this is in part because there is literally a whole bureaucracy inside Treasury whose sole job is to impose sanctions. When a bureaucracy is built around a mission, it will always push for more of the same. Telling these people that sanctions are ineffective is, in effect, telling them that their department has no real purpose. Once you get on the sanctions escalator against a country, the escalator only moves one way, upward. Whatever the president's views, whatever the Secretary of State thinks, the inertia inside the bureaucracy is always toward more sanctions, never toward lifting them. Countries dealing with the U.S. need to understand this. If sanctions are ever imposed, they are very unlikely to be reversed. We saw an illustration of this with Hungary. After meetings between Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and the U.S. President, Orban came away saying that the United States had permanently lifted sanctions on Hungarian oil and gas imports from Russia. Hungary's foreign minister said the same thing. But within hours, media leaks, clearly sourced from Treasury, insisted that this relief was only for 1 year. The president says one thing, the bureaucracy quietly tries to limit or reverse it. That is how these systems function. Let me return to the battlefield, because events there are equally dramatic. We've had more information from Zaporizhia. Zelinsky recently visited the Orikhiv area, where one of Ukraine's better remaining brigades is stationed. There is speculation that this brigade may be reassigned to the Hulaypol area to deal with the crisis there. The problem is that Orikhiv itself is now under pressure. The Russians are close to the southeast of Orikhiv. About a week or two ago, they appeared to capture most of the village of Malotokmachka, southwest of Orikhiv. though a large prison complex turned fortress remains under Ukrainian control for now. The Russians also hold well-established positions south of Orikhiv in Robotyne, the village Ukraine fought desperately to capture during its 2023 summer counteroffensive. Robotyne is now firmly under Russian control and is only a few kilometers from Orikhiv. The Russians are also strongly positioned to the west of Orikhiv, and they continue to advance along the east bank of the Dnipro River towards Zaporizhzhia city. Ukrainian authorities have had to evacuate villagers south of Zaporizhzhia because of Russian advances. That puts Russia in a strong position to clear the fortified town of Stepnohursk. If Russia controls Stepnohursk, it can threaten Orikhiv from the west as well. So transferring a strong brigade from Orikhiv eastward to shore up the crisis around Huliaipol risks exposing Orikhiv itself to encirclement or collapse. In my view, Orikhiv is more important than Huliaipol. Losing Orikhiv would almost certainly doom Huliaipol soon afterwards, and the crisis for Ukraine in that sector would deepen dramatically. Whether Ukraine actually has a coherent plan for this, I have my doubts. Perhaps more immediately interesting is Zelinsky's trip to the Pokrovsk area. This is the same man who only a week ago was claiming that there were merely 260 Russian troops in all of Pokrovsk, that talk of a Russian encirclement was nonsense, that Ukraine was conducting a mopping up operation there, and that the situation was difficult but far from critical. He dismissed Russian claims about Pokrovsk as lies. Now, during this recent trip, not into Pokrovsk itself, but to the surrounding area, Zelinsky suddenly says he would have no objection to a Ukrainian withdrawal from Pokrovsk, that it is up to the military to decide. He denies that he has been insisting on a fight to the last man and says he will accept whatever decision the military makes. I take that as conclusive confirmation that the Russians are now in full control of Pokrovsk, with perhaps only some mopping up left to do. Even Zelinsky has reconciled himself to that reality. A few days ago, I discussed a public argument between the head of Ukraine's general staff and Zelinsky over this very issue captured on video. The general bluntly said that certain decisions would be made regarding the Pokrovsk situation, that these decisions would not be disclosed until the consequences became clear, and that Zelinsky just had to accept that. Zelinsky clearly did not want to accept it, because he knows that if Pokrovsk falls, so too does the narrative that Ukraine is holding back Russia in Donbass, which has been the justification for ever more sanctions and weapons. In any case, the Ukrainian General Staff ordered withdrawals toward Mrnal-Red, deeper inside a Russian cauldron. To me, that indicates a General Staff operating on faulty information or wishful thinking. They appear to believe their own propaganda about successful counterattacks in surrounding villages. The reality, judging from Russian reports and available footage, is that these counterattacks failed and the Russians have consolidated their control. As a result, Ukrainian forces remaining inside what I would call the Pokrovsk-Mirnohard pocket are now essentially doomed. The territory they still hold has shrunk dramatically in the last week. Some analysts think Zelinsky's trips to Orikhiv, to near Pokrovsk, and then on to Greece are mostly about distracting from the corruption scandal raging in Kyiv. I don't doubt that's part of it. He wants to project an image of control and leadership, to appear as the commander visiting the front, rallying the troops, but in my opinion, the battlefield crisis is now so severe that he would likely be making these trips even without the political scandals in Kyiv. Zelinsky seems to believe that his physical presence magically boosts morale. That may once have been true. I doubt it still is. But these visits also serve a political function. They are a way of checking on and shoring up the loyalty of field commanders as the situation deteriorates. In truth, Ukraine's political, military, and economic crises all feed into each other. The political crisis in Kyiv would not exist if the front lines were stable. The budgetary and energy crises stem from the war. All of this is part of a single whole, and that whole is a war. Ukraine is rapidly losing. There remains a deep unwillingness in much of the West to acknowledge this truth. The amount of energy, money, and political will required now to reverse the situation is so enormous that I simply don't believe there is any appetite for it in Western capitals. And yet, we still hear people, even a former head of British intelligence in a recent interview, claim that the war is winnable if only sanctions are intensified enough to threaten Putin's position in Moscow. To me, that analysis is breathtakingly wrong. Any serious challenge to Putin domestically would not come from people who want him to end the war, but from people who think he has not gone far or fast enough. Ending the war prematurely before Russia's objectives are achieved is what would put him at risk. There is simply no connection between this reality and the fantasies some Western intelligence officials appear to be working with. Let me close with a brief strategic overview. Russian officials say the battle for Kupiansk is nearing its conclusion, with Ukrainian attempts to break the cauldron there petering out. They also speak of renewed offensives around Lyman and along the Zaporizhia front, including moves to encircle Huliopol and threaten further along the Dnipro. In my view, once Pokrovsk, Myrnorad, and Kupiansk fall, Russia's priority will remain the completion of the battle for Donbass, taking Lyman, Seversk, and then pushing on towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, breaking Ukraine's main defensive line in the east. Once Donbass falls, Ukraine's defensive system as a whole is fundamentally broken, and the war begins to shift into a true war of maneuver. At that point, operations against major cities like Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and ultimately perhaps Kharkiv become militarily more realistic, and operations along the southern axis from Kherson toward Odessa and the rest of the Black Sea coast also become more attractive. I do not believe Ukraine will sue for peace before it is effectively forced to. I do not believe the West is ready to face reality either. So the war will grind on. Russia, meanwhile, will continue its missile and drone campaign, likely at increasing intensity. As far as I can tell, we are nowhere near the peak of Russia's drone production capability. There are reports of at least 2 large drone factories, one apparently using North Korean labor, possibly even on North Korean territory. On that note, the deepening alliance between Russia and North Korea is another development Western media are largely ignoring. The volume of contacts between Russian and North Korean officials in recent months has been astonishing. I suspect Russian energy and technical assistance and possibly fertilizer supplies will help fuel a major upswing in North Korea's economy, which would explain the new self-confidence we see from Pyongyang. North Korean logistics troops are now present in western Russia, near the Ukrainian border, carrying out reconstruction work, singing North Korean songs. As they do so, if Russian footage is anything to go by, there is no indication they are directly involved in combat. But the symbolism of an open Russia-North Korea alliance is obvious, and it will have long-term implications for the security architecture of Northeast Asia. Meanwhile, Russia's ties with China remain strong, and its relationship with India appears to be deepening again. There are reports of major economic and military deals being prepared between Moscow and New Delhi. So, to sum up, the military situation for Ukraine continues to deteriorate. Zelensky remains president and is unlikely to be removed in the near term, but his options are narrowing. The West has no realistic plan to change the trajectory of this war. Sanctions against Russia are reaching their limits and may already be counterproductive. Russia's alliances with China, North Korea, and potentially deepened ties with India are strengthening, not weakening. That is where I will leave it today. Let me remind you again, you can find my work on a range of platforms, and your support, whether by following, sharing, or contributing, helps keep this analysis going. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I'm Larry C. Johnson. That's all from me for today. Have a very good day.